Early European explorers and settlers, and their respective colonial powers, erroneously considered the so-called New World to be nobody's land. There was a prevailing belief at the time that by discovering and settling lands in the New World, a nation then possessed title to those lands. When Indigenous people today assert Aboriginal title, it is a challenge to underlying Crown title. For almost 200 years, Canadian courts considered the source of Aboriginal title to be the Royal Proclamation, which meant that while Aboriginal title existed, it could be extinguished at the whim of the Crown. That changed with a Supreme Court ruling in 1973, when prior occupation was considered to be the source of Aboriginal title. The burden of proving prior occupation, however, lies with the Indigenous nation asserting Aboriginal title.
Well, hello, folks. Okay, today I'm going to try to do this quick take on something that, makes me think, and something that I think is worth thinking about. So anyway, a while ago I read this book called The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism and How It Came to Control Your Life. So anyway, it's a good book. It's short to the point. It doesn't mince words. It has plenty of nice, memorable anecdotes in it. For example, in this chapter that I'm thinking of now, it's the third chapter. It's the fairy tale of capitalism. So, basically the idea of capitalism is that you own property and you make things and sell it for a profit, and you need labor to do that. And in the olden days, it was slave labor and so on and so forth. And anyway, he was like, where do we trace the dawn of capitalism back to? And it's kind of hard to do, but he uses the story of the Portuguese island of Madeira. And since I'm in Portugal, it's kind of fun to talk about that. So according to encyclopedias and whatnot, the Greeks and Roman writers were possibly, and Vikings maybe, knew about Madeira, but it was basically a Terra Nullius, which is a concept that's interesting. So one important point in this chapter that starts off fairly early before he starts talking about Madeira, the story of Madeira from his perspective, is this concept of terra nullius. Terra nullius. So it's a Latin expression. It means nobody's land, right? So it's like there's this thing that Locke talked about, John Locke, and he's really important to know about John Locke. So he said in the beginning all the world was America. So this is in reference to his global theory of property. So property in the context of the Atlantic colonialism, breaking with interpretations that center on Locke's theory of labor. The chapter identifies Locke's theory of money as the linchpin of his liberal justification of English colonization in America. It brings into conversation the colonial interpretations of Locke with the earlier economic debates on the place of natural law, morality, and accumulation of capital in Locke's theory of property. It argues that by predicting property and improvement on monetization, Locke construes the absence of monetization in America as the sign that the continent remains in the state of natural common, open to the consequential appropriation. By invoking a fictive universal tacit consent of mankind, quote unquote, as the origin of money, Locke bridges the gap between his liberal theory of private property and the illiberality of extra-legal colonial expansion in the New World. So anyway, getting back to what George is talking about, Madeira. So there's this cycle that goes on, right? So the Portuguese start sailing around during the age of discovery, and around 1420 or so, in the 15th century, they run into this island, and they call it Madeira because that means wood, and it's a wooded island. It's covered in wood. And they say, this looks like a pretty good place, so why don't we live here? So they live there. They start cutting down trees and making pastures and raising pigs and ducks and chickens and whatever, cattle, whatever they did. So this island is off the Moroccan coast in the Atlantic Ocean. It's really beautiful. It's a great place to sail to if you're a sailor. These islands, these Portuguese islands are fantastic. So anyway, they go in there. This is the basic story. They go there, they claim it, they start working the land. Of course, this is way before John Locke, but they start working the land. Then they discover that it's a great place to grow sugar. And back then, sugar was a huge commodity. It's like later with the British Empire, tea and pepper and things like that were huge commodities. So you could finance a lot of stuff if you controlled that trade. And sugar was a big deal. So there was a lot of money in it, right? So from this being able to grow sugar, they need labor. You have to have labor. So you get slaves from Africa and other islands, because there's a slave trade going on. And they do the work, and they have to cut down all the trees because they have to burn the trees in order to refine the sugar, to get the sugar out of the sugar cane. So you basically destroy the whole island making sugar. You get your money from Flanders and from Florence, Firenze, from the money lenders in those places. New financialization systems come to life. So with the money and the labor, you're able to exploit the resources of this island. Basically, you completely, the slaves have to go further afield to get the wood, and after a while, there's no wood. So what do people do? Colonialist capitalists, and they didn't call themselves capitalists back then, of course, but they would just move on to the next island. So you go a little bit further south, you find another island, and you rinse and repeat. So boom, bust, and leave, move on, boom, bust, and move on. And eventually, obviously, they made it to Brazil, and they could have bigger plantations there and exploit more resources, and the story continues. Then later on, you have all these other colonial powers, Dutch and British and so on, French, that are doing the exact same thing. That's the name of the game. And apparently, during the British Empire, they extracted some obscene amount of money in today's money from India. Something like $22 trillion or something like that, before they finally, the jewel in the crown was busted and they left. So boom, bust, and leave. And then today we do the same thing. So there is always something that, capitalists need to make their stuff, to make their profits. And the financialization becomes more complex. The financial instruments become more complex until you get to a point where the wealthy people are just trading financial instruments, abstractions, right? Derivatives and so on. And you have these housing crises and so on. But it's always the same. It's boom, bust, and leave. Move on. No one's ever held to account for any of the externalities or negative consequences or that are unintended, perhaps intended, but boom, bust, and move on. So I've always thought of people as the most pernicious and dangerous, deadly, destructive, invasive species in the world. And if human beings could go to other planets where there were intelligent beings, we would completely destroy all the people there. We would murder them all, take all their stuff, and do with it what we do. So the logic of the system's logic is like a religion. You believe in it. You think it's just natural law, getting back to John Locke. You know, there's some universal tacit consent of mankind, right? You really have to read Locke to understand anything about what's going on in the world, and other people like that. But anyway, so in short, that's basically it. You know, you go in, you exploit the resources, you extract the wealth, you use labor, other people's energy, basically. And of course, once we got to the 19th century, then we're into fossil capital zones. We have this incredible energy source which changes everything, makes it much easier to exploit, and we can change the story because we have better tools. So our propaganda, marketing, PR become better, and we kind of convince everybody that this is all great and that the balance of nature doesn't matter, and so on. The end of these cycles of boom, bust, and leave, of exploitation and extraction and destruction of our invasive species, is that eventually we destroy our habitat and then it all busts and we disappear. Well, I think what will happen is we'll have a degrowth just due to circumstances, and we'll have to deal with it one way or another. And there may or may not be 5,000 of us left at the end of the day, 100 years from now, or God knows. And then we'll come back again, and we might just do the same thing all over again, right? We have we're sitting on a garbage heap, and you know, the microplastics and the forever chemicals and all the rest of it. It's just one big, huge landfill. And maybe nature will bounce back and rewild the planet, and people will, you know, be digging around, and they'll say, oh shit, we better make this again and do it all over. There's inherent violence to it and destruction in it, but we're trained not to notice it. And so we become addicted to all the poison of modernity, and we get sick, and then we take pills and go to the hospital and get fixed. And you know, he also made the point that in the old days, you know, economies were connected to traditions and other values and other things that people could appreciate when they were just merely serfs or whatever. There was a structure, an order to it. And, you know, it was slightly different, but it got out of hand, basically, Canary Islands and Portugal and the whole story of European colonialization. And then today we have America colonizing Europe with its extremist neoliberal ideology, religious belief, akin to kind of a religious belief. And everybody over here is just busy becoming more and more steeped in that madness. So you have Barcelona, which is just an Airbnb with a bunch of British pubs and Northern European puke on the sidewalks. And you have less and less culture and so on. And this happens all over the place. Everybody dresses like Americans, but they're not American enough until the neoliberal project goes to its ultimate extreme and destroys the whole bloody place. And we'll do that with nukes, or we'll do that just as a slow burn with climate change, or we'll do that just by poisoning ourselves. And all the time we'll be tech optimists, and we'll think that some machine or some technology is going to save us. We need science, we need technology, we need education, we need all these things. They're not bad things in and of themselves. but it's how you apply them to living in harmony within the limits of nature here, you know. So that's it. Boom, bust, leave. Look up Madeira, study it. It's interesting. Study the age of discovery, the Portuguese efforts in the beginning. Learn all about it. Have fun. Enjoy Sunday. William T. out.